There is a moment in every garden when growth suddenly slows down. Leaves stop stretching toward the light. Roots pause underground, and most people reach for fertilizer, assuming the plant is hungry. But what if the plant was never the one that needed feeding? Hold a jar of thick black molasses up to the light, and it looks almost too simple to matter. A syrup meant for baking, something most people keep in the pantry and forget about. Yet, the moment this dark stream touches water and spreads through soil, a completely different system wakes up. Because soil is not just dirt. Beneath every plant lives an entire economy of organisms, bacteria, fungi, microscopic workers that process minerals, unlock nutrients, and transport them directly to roots. In healthy soil, these microbes are constantly active. But in many modern gardens, especially soil that has been tilled, dried out, or treated with strong fertilizers, much of that life slows down and goes dormant. They are present, but they are waiting. Molasses is not feeding the plant. It is sending an energy signal into the soil, a sudden pulse of carbohydrates that microbes recognize immediately. Within hours, populations begin to multiply. Within days, the soil itself starts behaving differently. Warmer, more active, more capable of breaking down organic matter and releasing nutrients that were locked away. Farmers understood this long before laboratory studies could explain it. In the early decades of the 20th century, before synthetic fertilizers dominated agriculture, molasses was sometimes applied directly to fields to stimulate soil biology. It looked strange even then. Sticky syrup poured into irrigation water. But the results were visible in the crops that followed. Today, the practice sounds almost too simple to be taken seriously. But in this video, we are going to look closely at what actually happens when sugar enters the soil ecosystem. Why microbes respond so quickly. Why the type of molasses matters more than most people realize, and how a single spoonful diluted correctly can shift the balance of life underground in ways that plants immediately benefit from. Because once the soil wakes up, the plant rarely struggles for long. To understand why molasses works, you have to look at how plants behave when they are left alone in natural soil. Most people imagine roots simply absorbing nutrients like straws pulling water from the ground. But that is not how most plants actually survive. Roots are negotiators. They trade energy for services. Through photosynthesis, a plant produces sugars inside its leaves using sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water. What many gardeners do not realize is that a significant portion of that sugar, often close to a third of what the plant makes, is intentionally released into the soil through the roots. Not wasted, invested. Those sugars act like payment to nearby microbes. Bacteria and fungi respond immediately because sugar is energy they can use right away. In exchange, these microorganisms perform tasks the plant cannot do alone. They break down organic matter, dissolve minerals trapped in soil particles, and transform raw elements into forms that roots can absorb safely. It is a quiet partnership known as the soil food web. When molasses enters this system, it changes the scale of that partnership almost overnight. Instead of relying only on the sugar the plant can produce, microbes suddenly receive an external supply of carbohydrates. For them, it's like discovering an unexpected food source in the middle of a long winter. Population growth follows quickly. Beneficial bacteria multiply. Fungal networks expand. As they consume the sugars, they begin processing organic material already present in the soil. Old roots, compost fragments, microscopic debris. During this process, nutrients such as nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and trace minerals are released in a form that plants can absorb without stress. At the same time, something else happens that gardeners often notice without fully understanding why. Harmful organisms begin to decline. Not because molasses kills them directly, but because the balance of power shifts. When beneficial microbes dominate the environment, disease-causing pathogens and certain soil pests struggle to compete for space and resources. In other words, the soil becomes crowded with allies. This is why the molasses method is often misunderstood when people call it a fertilizer. Technically, It is not delivering large amounts of nutrients itself. What it is doing instead is accelerating the biological system that already knows how to release those nutrients naturally. It is less like adding food to a plant and more like funding an entire workforce that works beneath the surface, quietly transforming ordinary soil into something alive again. At this point, most gardeners get excited and make the same mistake. They assume more sugar must mean faster results. But soil biology does not work that way. In fact, pouring thick syrup directly onto the ground usually creates the opposite of what we want. Instead of feeding microbes evenly, it creates concentrated pockets of sugar that attract ants, disrupt oxygen levels, and slow down the balance of the soil ecosystem. What works is dilution. Think of molasses not as a fertilizer, but as an energy signal that needs to spread gently through the soil where microbes live. The mixture farmers quietly used for decades is surprisingly simple, and once you understand the ratio, it becomes almost impossible to get wrong. The golden ratio is 1 teaspoon of molasses for 1 gallon of water, which is roughly 4 liters. That amount is enough to stimulate microbial activity without overwhelming the system. It is a small dose, but in living soil, small signals can trigger very large biological responses. The next detail matters more than many people realize. Not all molasses behaves the same way in the garden. The label must say unsulfured molasses and ideally blackstrap molasses. This is important because sulfur, while useful in some agricultural contexts, acts as an antimicrobial compound. Its purpose in processing molasses was originally to preserve it and prevent fermentation. But in soil biology, that same property can slow down or damage the very microbes we are trying to encourage. In other words, the wrong molasses can quiet the soil instead of waking it up. Once you have the right type, the preparation becomes almost meditative. Start with warm water, not boiling, just warm enough to help dissolve the thick syrup. Add 1 tablespoon and stir slowly until the liquid turns a deep amber color and the molasses disappears into the water completely. When the mixture is smooth, you can pour it into a watering can or bucket and dilute it further if needed. What you end up with is something gardeners sometimes call microbial tea, not compost tea, not fertilizer, just water carrying a small amount of energy that soil organisms recognize immediately. And when this mixture reaches the ground, the real work begins below the surface. Once the molasses tea is prepared, the next question becomes how to introduce it into the garden in a way that supports the soil instead of overwhelming it. There are 2 reliable methods that experienced gardeners tend to use, and each one activates a slightly different part of the plant-microbe relationship. The first method is the soil drench, and this is where the strongest results usually appear. Instead of watering plants quickly from above, you slowly apply the diluted molasses mixture directly to the soil around the base of the plant. The goal is to let the solution soak into the root zone where microbial communities are already active and waiting for energy. When done this way, the sugar signal spreads through the upper layers of soil where bacteria and fungi are most concentrated. Within days, many gardeners notice subtle changes. Soil becoming darker, slightly looser, and easier to keep moist. Plants respond by producing deeper green leaves and stronger stems, not because the molasses fed them directly, but because the microbes around their roots began working faster. Timing matters here. Warm days during the growing season are when soil biology is most active. When the soil is warm, microbes metabolize sugar quickly and convert it into nutrient cycling almost immediately. In colder soil, the effect is much slower. The second method surprises many people the first time they hear about it. Foliar application. This means spraying a very diluted version of the mixture directly onto plant leaves. For this method, the concentration is cut in half, about half a tablespoon per gallon of water, so that the solution remains light and gentle. Leaves are not sterile surfaces. Just like soil, they host communities of beneficial microbes. When a very thin layer of diluted sugar lands on the leaf surface, it feeds those protective microorganisms. In many cases, This can help plants resist certain fungal diseases because the beneficial microbes outcompete harmful spores before they establish themselves. There is also a second advantage. Plants are capable of absorbing certain trace minerals directly through their leaves, including iron, magnesium, and calcium that may already be present in the molasses mixture. It is not a replacement for soil nutrition, but it can give plants a subtle boost during periods of active growth. However, timing again becomes important. Foliar sprays should be applied in the evening or during cooler parts of the day. Under strong sunlight, droplets on leaves can increase stress or cause minor leaf burn, especially if the surface becomes sticky. Used carefully, both methods work together. The soil drench energizes the underground ecosystem, while the foliar spray strengthens the protective layer on the plant itself. And when both systems are active, the roots below and the leaves above, the entire garden begins to behave differently. There is a reason old farmers treated molasses with respect. It is simple, cheap, and extremely effective, but only when used with restraint. When gardeners hear that sugar can wake up soil biology, the instinct is often to add more, apply it more often, or treat it like a regular fertilizer. That is where problems begin. The first and most common mistake is making the mixture too strong. Thick syrup poured directly onto soil does not behave like diluted microbial tea. Instead, it becomes a signal flare for insects, especially ants. Sugar is one of the most powerful attractants in nature, and if the concentration is too high, entire ant colonies will discover it within hours. What was meant to feed microbes suddenly becomes a buffet on the soil surface. This is why the 1 teaspoon per gallon ratio matters. It is strong enough for microbes, but weak enough to avoid turning your garden into an insect highway. The second mistake is applying it too frequently. Soil is a living system that needs balance between air, moisture, microbes, and organic matter. When too much sugar enters the soil too often, bacteria multiply so quickly that they begin consuming large amounts of oxygen in the root zone. Plants need that oxygen just as much as microbes do. If the soil becomes temporarily depleted, roots can slow down instead of speeding up. That is why experienced gardeners use molasses as a periodic stimulus rather than a routine watering habit. Once every 2 weeks during active growth is usually more than enough to trigger the biological response we want. The third mistake is seasonal timing. In cold soil, the microbial world is mostly inactive. Bacteria and fungi slow down dramatically when temperatures drop, almost like hibernation. If molasses is applied when the ground is still cold, the sugar simply sits in wet soil without being processed by microbes. Instead of energizing the ecosystem, it can create conditions that encourage rot or unwanted fermentation. Waiting until soil temperatures rise above about 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius ensures that the microbial workforce is awake and ready to respond. In other words, molasses is powerful precisely because it interacts with life in the soil. But like any biological system, that life responds best to small signals, not overwhelming doses. When people think about fertilizer, they usually imagine bags, labels, and numbers printed on the side of a store shelf. But the most powerful fertility system in the garden has always been invisible. It lives in the soil already, quietly waiting for the right conditions to begin working again. A single spoon of molasses does not feed a plant in the traditional sense. Instead, it wakes up the community beneath it, the bacteria and fungi that turn minerals into food, that protect roots from disease, and that slowly transform lifeless dirt into something dark, crumbly, and full of structure. When that process begins, the difference becomes visible above ground. Leaves deepen in color, stems strengthen, vegetables develop better flavor because the plant is no longer surviving. It is cooperating with the soil around it. And that is the quiet shift many gardeners eventually discover. The goal is not to force plants to grow faster with stronger chemicals. The goal is to rebuild the living system that plants were always meant to grow in. So instead of feeding the plant directly, feed the life beneath it. Because once the soil is alive again, It takes care of everything else. See you in the garden. If this exploration of the hidden life within your soil has changed the way you look at your garden, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the ancient wisdom and natural history that modern methods have often overlooked. Let's grow a better future together. The next secret of the earth will be revealed soon.